The trouble is that it gets even harder in video games. One of the reasons is that, in addition to being very important, they're also the most artificial part of a point of work, part of any narrative work. We sort of begin stories pretty easily in everyday life, but finding tidy, conclusive endings in our everyday life is not at all a common thing. Endings are very unnatural in any kind of sense, and so being able to construct something so artificial takes a lot of work on the part of an artist. That, again, is complicated by the fact that as you increase agency and transformation in narrative-based video games, the ending, the responsibility of ending a work is taken more and more away from an artist, their capacity to fight against, in some sense, the will of the guest. There is a certain amount of conflict there, and at an extreme, the responsibility of ending a work is actually left to the guest. That's a different thing for this form of art as opposed to any other, and it does make ending narrative-based video games very difficult, because if the guest wants the work to continue, then the transformative ideal, the ideal of agency is the work will continue. So balancing those two things is a really tricky task, and something that needs to be carefully considered. So what I've done is I've constructed what I call the vexed triangle, which puts transformation, agency, and narrative at various points in this sort of continuum, and then shows various works that have two of the three elements, but there really isn't a sort of silver bullet that lies right in the middle that manages to achieve all three at once. So just to go through these really quickly, transformation and narrative combined together, this multiplicity of perspectives combined with a strong narrative story arc and a satisfying ending. Those are traditions that we see in a lot of modern and postmodern art. So Ulysses is one of the prototypes, James Joyce's novel. As I Lay Dying is a sort of American answer a few years later. And the Norman Conquest, a play I'll refer to a little bit later, a set of plays that really do manage to keep along that edge. However, they obviously have no sense of agency, because agency is something unique to narrative-based video games. Along another axis, you have very traditional video games which take a single perspective and you move through the world. Your amount of agency is somewhat limited and your transformative capacity is near nil. You only get the one perspective on the work. So the Zelda series, the Mario series, all these old Nintendo-style games, and also something more recent like Tim Schafer's Psychonauts, all fit in this mold. And then on the bottom, you have some really innovative works that are doing interesting things and maximizing both agency and transformation in works like Oblivion and the World of Warcraft. World of Warcraft, though, it presents the problems and shows the problems of really concluding and tying up a work satisfyingly. World of Warcraft's business model is founded on the fact that people don't want their games to end. They want to continue this world for as long as they feel it and are enjoying it. But the thing with World of Warcraft is that these games that maximize agency and transformation are, in some sense, novelties. It's very neat and very new to be able to work in worlds or with works of art that do maximize both transformation and agency in this way. And yet it's difficult to repeat the appeal of novelties that's sort of built into the name. And so at some point, as video games as a form, as we fully explore what it is that video games as a form are able to achieve, we're going to run into the requirements of narrative, where people are going to want an ending more satisfying than them just getting tired of the game. They want to have their entertainment actually tie it up and be conclusive. So to propose a solution to how to achieve this, I actually want to shift gears pretty dramatically and start talking about StarCraft. StarCraft was a real-time strategy game that came out a few years ago, and I think offers an interesting object lesson for how we can move forward in solving this problem. So StarCraft was in this real, and it should be clear, first of all, that I'm speaking solely of StarCraft as a game, like chess and bridge are games. In terms of narrative, StarCraft isn't a terribly interesting game, but it does offer some interesting lessons in terms of gameplay. So prior to StarCraft, you had a sort of world that was dominated by this game Command and Conquer, and Blizzard tried to release two games, their Warcraft games, immediately prior, at about the same time. And the difference that you noticed between the two, the reason why Command and Conquer was a more interesting game than the Warcraft titles, was because Command and Conquer featured very distinct.
5 minutes left.
Before 30 minutes?
You said 25 minutes. Right?
No, I'm up to 30 now. I have 10. So Command and Conquer was a game that had really distinct armies and sort of unit sets. And when two armies in Command and Conquer fought each other, it was a pretty unique game, depending on which side you were on. Warcraft had more interchangeable armies and was less interesting as a consequence. What StarCraft did was it embraced the concept of distinctness and then added a third army into the mix. And that made it a far more interesting game than just Command and Conquer with its two armies going head to head. But it retained this sense of distinctness. You had on the other axis a game that came out about the same time, but where there were a whole bunch of armies that you could play as. They were all pretty distinct. They had some small differences, but mostly it was the same game over and over again. With StarCraft, what you got was a very different game depending on which army you chose, and even within that, a slightly more different game depending on which army you were playing against. It became a really distinct gameplay experience depending on which choice you made at the very beginning. And so that's kind of what I used as lessons from StarCraft. The idea is, first of all, is that moving towards a different paradigm, moving from the idea of distinct armies towards a multiplicity of armies, that first step is the most difficult to achieve, but it's also the most significant. You get the most bang for your buck on it. Also, a seemingly small change from 2 armies to 3, it had a real outsized impact. The strategy built into StarCraft is much, much higher than inherent to the sort of 2 players against one another games. Finally, the work that's created, StarCraft was a really fun game, and that's also important to recognize. The game that comes out of these ideals should not only be experimental, it should also be fun for its own sake. So finally, we can recap real fast here of what it is that we're trying to do. We're trying to find what it is that narrative-based games are good at vis-a-vis other forms of art, and we also want to find a constructive balance between the 3 points of the triangle: agency, narrative, and transformation. And StarCraft has taught us that small changes in the nature of games and small movements from one point in a continuum to another have outsized impacts. So, the solution that I've come up with is something called that I'm calling multipath gaming. Multipath gaming is actually already a defined term, and what it's meant in the past, it sort of takes 2 forms. It can either be a narrative that splits at one point and then sort of comes back together rapidly, or you have a number of multiple endings that are often performance-based. If you do really well in finishing the game, then you get one ending. If you do not as well, then you get a less impressive ending, or whatever it is. What I want to mean by this term is having a point early in the narrative structure where the narrative splits, and you have a choice to go in one of 2 different directions. You carry through the implications of that choice through the entire world of the work, and then have the ability to go back, make that choice again, and go down a different path. This is just a diagram that sort of illustrates this. You have here a decision or performance-based branch point. In the old style of game, you can go in 2 different directions, but pretty quickly in all games that utilize this, you're shunted back into a single branch of narrative, and then you also have the multiple endings. What I'm trying to argue for is something where you go along a path, you reach a major decision point, you actually do decide. It isn't performance-based at all. You make a choice which way you want to take the story, and then the story is carried through in fairly standard linear style, just with 2 very different endings and different paths to get